Sejam todos bem-vindos ao Teaços, mais uma vez, sexta-feira, dia 1º de setembro. São tantos teaços que as datas ficam confusas. Hoje nós teremos um grande prazer de receber um convidado ilustre, um convidado bastante importante no mundo junguiano, no mundo das publicações e das pesquisas junguianas, o professor Martin Liebscher. Um prazer conhecê-lo, professor. Desculpa não ter chegado antes para poder recebê-lo, estava terminando um seminário, mas é um prazer recebê-lo. Vou fazer a apresentação primeiro formal. Martin Liebscher é professor do Departamento de Alemão e professor sênior honorário do Centro de Histórias das Disciplinas Psicológicas da Universidade College, em Londres. Seus interesses de pesquisa estão na filosofia alemã dos séculos XIX e XX, especialmente Friedrich Nietzsche e Arthur Schopenhauer, na história conceitual do inconsciente e nos fundamentos históricos e filosóficos da psicologia analítica. Suas publicações incluem Pensando o Inconsciente, Pensamento Alemão do século XIX, e Libido e Vontade de Poder, o confronto de Jung com Nietzsche. Como editor, o trabalho de Martin para a Philemon Foundation inclui Psicologia Analítica no Exílio, a correspondência entre Jung e Erich Neumann, as palestras de Jung na ETH, do Instituto Federal de Tecnologia, em Zurique, e o volume 6, sobre a psicologia do yoga e meditação oriental. E o volume 7, que será o tema da apresentação dele hoje para nós, os exercícios espirituais de Inácio de Loyola. Ele também é coeditor dos volumes 5 e 8, Psicologia do Inconsciente e Alquimia, e ele colaborou na tradução dos livros negros. Atualmente, está trabalhando no manuscrito de Jung de 1937 sobre alquimia. Esses são alguns livros que o professor Martin editou. Esses são as cartas de Jung e Erich Neumann. Trabalho volumoso, né, professor? Quase 400 páginas. Psicologia da yoga e meditação, que também é um trabalho vigoroso, bastante interessante. E o trabalho que vai ser o nosso tema da nossa palestra, os exercícios espirituais de Inácio de Loyola. Professor, prazer te receber. Obrigado por ter aceito o nosso convite. Para nós, público brasileiro, comunidade brasileira junguiana, acho que é uma oportunidade rara recebê-lo aqui entre nós, de alguém que está tão envolvido com a publicação dos seminários do Jung, com a obra do Jung, com o texto do próprio Jung. Então, espero que, para você, seja tão importante e valioso como tem sido para nós te receber. Muito obrigado pela sua presença. Por favor, fique à vontade.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Marcus, for this very kind introduction and indeed invitation. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to speak this afternoon at the 100th meeting of the Tiassos group. So congratulations to this achievement.
Martin,
if I'm
Isa. Então, ok. A sua imagem tinha sumido, mas voltou. Está ótimo.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So when we spoke about the preparation for this seminar, you just told me that you were interested in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola and Jung's lectures on this topic, and that you were just reading it. So I thought it would be appropriate, as it had just come out in that year, to give you a short introduction into the editing work that I've done. So let me just see if the PowerPoint works here. Yeah, just a moment. Can you see the second slide? Sorry. No? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So here you can see the ETH Zurich, on the right-hand side of the slide, the Technical University of Zurich, where Jung from 1933 to 1941 gave lectures. That was about 30 years after he had stopped giving lectures at the University of Zurich in 1933. He was invited to come back to the academic realm and to give lectures at the ETH. The difference to the lectures at the Zurich University was that here he was at the Technical University and could therefore teach in the free subject area. So every student at the Technical University at that time was supposed to have also a kind of general education, and the university provided these kind of lectures. And this is where Jung was lecturing from 1933 to 41. He was free to choose his subjects. And as you can imagine, there was already in 1933, there were was a lot of interest. These lectures took place every Friday from 6 to 7 o'clock. It was so enormous, the interest, that they had to move it from a smaller room to the Auditorium Maximum, so the biggest hall of the university. So at the beginning, we talk about 500 participants for each lecture. The audience consisted of different of students of the technical subjects, as I said before, but also a lot of followers of Jung, people who were patients or others who were in Zurich to study with Jung and in the Jungian circle, and a lot of now famous names. For instance, you mentioned before Erich Neumann. So when Erich Neumann came to Zurich, just from Germany on his way to Palestine, he just stopped in Zurich, and during that time he visited the lectures in 1933 of Jung. Wolfgang Pauli, who you will be aware, and you know that Jung interpreted his dreams famously. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli was a regular attendant of the lectures. Joseph Bernhard Lang, we have accounts of the lectures by Lang. He was the therapist of Hermann Hesse, the author. So there were a lot of different students and interested, well-known followers of Jung. One of the participants was Kurt Binswanger, for instance, and from Kurt Binswanger we have an interesting account who tells us how well prepared Jung was for every lecture, and he particularly liked the fact that Jung would sit in front of his lecture hall long before he started, and he would probably smoke his pipe, and then students could sit next to him and get some kind of first-hand information and discussion even before the lecture started. So a very personal touch of Jung that comes also through in the lectures that we edited. So here I have provided a short overview of the project that the Philemon Foundation has undertaken. So we have split up the lectures, or it's obvious there are eight volumes, so split up into 8 volumes. The first 2 have already been published, as well as you said, the volume 6 and 7. Whereas the first years, you might say, are more about a kind of general introduction into Jung's psychology and the historical background of Jung's psychology. We have an interesting change from volume 6 to the last volume of volume 8. And as you have seen before, volume 6 is Jung's, I can show you again, is Jung's lecture series on Eastern meditation. This Eastern meditation, so what is really interested in is twofold. One is the individuation process, and the other one is meditation. Meditation, because he sees the parallel between meditative practices in Eastern traditions, such as yoga, and the active imagination as a psychological device that he used and has developed. The second volume is then we will talk about today, is on Ignatius of Loyola and the spiritual exercises. So I have them here on the left side. So we have seen them before as well. So we have the Eastern meditation, and then it jumps to the Western equivalent. He calls this the only Western equivalent to the Eastern yoga, and that are the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. And interesting enough, the final volume is also linked to this. So it's also still in the bracket of Jung's lectures on the process of individuation. And that is on the psychology of alchemy and Hermetic philosophy. And what it does, so to speak, it brings this parallel between these 3 streams. So Eastern meditation, Western meditation, and Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, and trying to show the parallels that these traditions have with his own analytical psychology and the individuation process. So here, one more time, you can see here the, here you see once more the volumes that have already been published. We'll soon the volume 8 on the alchemy that has been edited by my colleague Christoph Wagner and me will be out. I assume it will come out next spring. Good. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction to Jung's understanding of the spiritual exercises. I've split this up into 7 points. I hope we have enough time to go into all of them, but I think we have a lot of time to discuss the points that I've not mentioned later on. So the first point I want to talk about is Jung's relationship with Roman Catholicism, and in particular, what role his understanding of the Jesuits and the Jesuit order, the Societas Jesu, is, and what his relationship was. Then I want to look at the Black Books shortly and the Liber Novus, where this kind of relationship is also depicted. Then I go into the 1930s. We look at Roman Catholic conservatism in the Europäische Kulturbund, his relationship to members of the so-called Catholic modernist movement or Catholic modernism. I will explain this. And finally, I want to show you some of the literature that Jung uses and that informed his understanding of the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. So the interesting thing is, every one of you who has read Jung's semi-autobiographical account, Dreams, Memory, Reflections, will see that one of the earliest memories that Jung has is indeed related to Jesuits. So there's this, we might recall this scene that one day when he was a little boy in the village, he sees this man with a strangely broad hat and a long black garment coming down from the wood. And maybe you would like to read the first quotation. Yeah. Okay. So at the sight of him, I was overcome with fear, which rapidly grew into deadly terror as the frightful recognition shot through my mind. That is a Jesuit. Shortly before, I had overheard a conversation between my father and a visiting colleague concerning the nefarious activities of the Jesuits. From the half-irritated, half-fearful tone of my father's remarks, I gathered that Jesuit meant something specially dangerous, even for my father. Actually, I had no idea what Jesuits were, but I was familiar with the word Jesus from my little prayer. So it then continues to talk about that he remembered that when he was a child, a conversation his father had with a colleague about the danger of the Jesuits. He didn't know what Jesuits were, but he knew it from his little prayers. And then he says, and this is in the protocols. This is not the memory, dreams, reflection, but the text that Daniela Jaffe took notes. She says there, I thought they are devils. That's why they are in disguise. So I had a fear, like in the dream of the phallus. The Jesuits, the Catholics in general, are completely other. So that is what Jung says to Daniela Jaffe on 18th of January 1957. What we have to take into consideration here is that the Jesuits at the time of Jung's childhood were prohibited. Their presence was prohibited in Switzerland, as indeed in many other European countries. In Switzerland, there was a particular passus in the constitution that did not allow the presence of Jesuits. And that came because there was a war in 1847, the so-called Sonderbund War. And that was a war between the Protestant cantons and the Catholic cantons. And the Catholic cantons were, of course, supported heavily by the Jesuit order. So when they lost, one of the demands was that Jesuits had to leave Switzerland. So there was a kind of general fear in Switzerland of in the population of Jesuit and the Jesuit order. And that we can see all the way up to the 1930s, when Jung is organizing with Olga Fröbe-Kaptein an Eranos conference. And she asks him, oh, can we invite Hugo Rana, the famous Jesuit who was at that time in Innsbruck in Austria? And Jung replies saying, that's a bit of a danger. You know how people react to Jesuits, and we don't want to be in troubles. Later on, he would of course speak at the Eranos conference, but there was still this kind of prejudice in certain circles, Protestant circles, and as we know, Jung's father was of course a Reformed pastor. Yeah, I chose this picture here to get some kind of idea of how the garment might have looked like. This is another sort of picture image. This is from a book from 1695 by a Jesuit monk called Sebastian Izquierdo. So that was about 100 years after Ignatius. And he published this introduction to the spiritual exercises, the commentaries on the spiritual exercises, and with that kind of images. And why this is one of from the first week. This is what happened to people, those of us who live in the eternal fire. Quis habitat ex nobis quo adorib septernis. So we can see this is what people have to imagine when they would not follow the right path, and this is the eternal condemnation. So this is one of the books that Jung used as a preparation for his seminar or his lecture series on the spiritual exercises. So no wonder that this idea of fear of Roman Catholicism plays a role, and this respect of Roman Catholicism in the early life of Jung and also later on. Not a coincidence that he chose maybe a book with that kind of drastic imagery. As a kid, as a child, to continue in the memories of Jung, as a child he recounts that he was very little. He was with his parents in a village, and there was a Catholic church, and he goes inside and he stumbles over the threshold, falls down, gets himself a bloody knee. And the interesting thing is that he writes then in his memories, and this is quotation number 2, for years afterward, I was unable to set foot inside the Catholic Church without a secret fear of blood and falling and Jesuits. That was the aura of atmosphere that hung about it. But at the same time, it always fascinated me. The proximity of a Catholic priest made me even uneasy, if that were possible. So this is the Jesuit motto that we see here of the Societas Jesu. This the Jesuits have a small role to play also in the Black Book and in the Liber Novus. On the 19th of April 1940, Jung wrote in what is now published in the last part of the Red Book as the Scrutinies. He writes about his confrontation with the I, on which he depended, since the God has arisen and spreads himself in whichever fiery heavens. Quotation number 3. Pitiful creature, I will torment you a bit if you do not make an effort. What are you moaning about? Others could do it better than you. Why compare with others? There are some who are even worse at it. You're unbelievably stubborn. Perhaps the whip will help you. Ha! Now that gets under your skin. Take that and that. What does it taste of? Of blood, presumably. In majorem Dei gloriam. Do you want more? Or do you want love? Or what goes by the name? One can only teach with love if blows do not bear fruit. So I will love you, I embrace you as a visible sign of my love. Yeah. So this phrase that we see here in the text is ad majorem Dei gloriam. That is the motto of the Societas Jesu, a phrase that is often attributed to Inácio de Loyola, whereas actually it comes from Gregory the Great. Ad majorem Dei gloriam inque hominum salutem, to the greater glory of God and the salvation of mankind. What it shows us here is once again this kind of negative image in the midst of this tormenting scene of the torturing the eye using a whip, and in the midst of that suddenly comes the motto of the this emblem of the Societas Jesu. So you can see that even in 1914, in his time when Jung has this encounter with his unconscious, the Jesuits play a role and come up in that particular and important scene. Continuing with his memories, he says it was not until in my 30s, he says in Memories, Dreams and Reflections, that I was able to confront Mater Ecclesia without the sense of oppression. The first time was in Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Now, if we follow that argument, then this would have been probably at this visit of Freud, maybe in 1907, but we have the original protocols, and interesting enough, Jung does not talk about the 1930s, about in his 30s, he writes, and he says, Daniela Jaffe, in his 50s. So he says the first time that I could actually enter the Mater Ecclesia without difficulties or impression was in Vienna, in St. Stephen's, in my 50s. So if we calculate that, then we're coming into the 1920s, late 30s, and there Jung was a number of times in Vienna. He was in Vienna by invitation of the so-called Europäische Kulturbund. The Europäische Kulturbund, I don't know whether you are familiar with that, was an organization that was founded by the man that you see on your picture here, Karl Anton Prinz Rohan. He was from noble background, nobility, and his, as so many people, he supported the monarchy that had been abolished in 1918. And the idea was to bring a kind of Central European, Catholically orientated realm, monarchy, back to Central Europe. And to bring the kind of awareness of that, he started to, with this Europäische Kulturbund, to invite people from that particular spectrum, scholars, artists, academia, to present at conferences, and also in Vienna, of course. On the right-hand side, you see Yolande Jacobi. Yolande Jacobi, who, as you know, became one of the close collaborators of Jung after the Second World War. She was originally from Budapest, was Jewish, converted to Protestantism, and at the time of when she was in Vienna, working as a secretary or as a general administrative secretary to Karl Anton Prinz Rohan, she converted to Roman Catholicism. And she will be later on very important to establish contacts with Catholic scholars, theologians, contact between Jung and those theologians. So this is where Jung presented. This is where Jung was in Vienna. He became very involved in this movement. He published a number of famous articles with the Europäische Revue. That was the journal of the Europäische Kulturbund. And even he chaired the conference, partially chaired the conference when he was held in Zurich. Was held in Zurich. So that might have been one of the times when he actually, because of this contact in Vienna, at that time, this oppression that he felt towards Catholicism eased away slightly at the time, at the late 20s, beginning of the 30s. So here again, we see depictions of Sebastian Izquierdo's book on the spiritual exercises. Sorry, let's go back. Yeah, on the left-hand side, you see Ignatius, how when he writes the spiritual exercises then in the middle you see a depiction of the first week, when the angels, the fight between the good angels and the bad angels, and the bad angels falling out of heaven. So, and on the right-hand side above, you see how those going to paradise and those going into condemnation, and damnation leaving to the left upper image side or to the bottom of the right side. And the reader is supposed to, and the one who does the exercises is supposed to share and discern where he wants to go. So that was one of the Latin text of this Sebastian Izquierdo book, was one of the texts that Jung used during the lectures. Another one was the German translation by a man called Philipp Funk that we have here. He published the translation, a German translation of the spiritual exercises, together with a translation of the semi-autobiographical text Reminiscences of Ignatius in this book that you can see. Jung used that for the lectures and for the preparations of the lectures. Now there's also an introduction by Funk, and this is interesting because Funk originally wanted to become a priest and went to the priest seminary, but already during the time in the seminary, he supported the so-called Catholic modernist movement. So the Catholic modernism was, you might be familiar with that, but was the attempt to bring together the knowledge of the 19th, 20th century, scientific knowledge, scientific achievement, and bring this together with the dogma of the Catholic Church, basically to modernize the church at the beginning of the 20th century, which was, of course, rejected by the Pope and by the leading bishops and the clergy in the Vatican, and most of those who supported modernism were expelled, excommunicated, or had to repent for supporting this movement. So you can imagine that Funk's understanding of Ignatius of Loyola and the spiritual exercises, Funk being a modernist, would not give Jung necessarily the most positive image of Ignatius and the Societas Jesu. So it's very much this idea of the Jesuits as part of the Counter-Reformation, as those who support the Pope and the Church without questioning rationally what this is about. So this is the argument of Funk that Jung gets to know here. And another person that is more important in that regard is Ernesto Bonaiuti. Now, Ernesto Bonaiuti was an Italian priest. He spoke a number of times, almost every year in the 1930s at the Eranos conferences. So Jung knew him well. And not only that, in 1935, he was asked to speak on the exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Now, what we know to know about Bonaiuti is that he was also the author of the Modernist Manifesto. So he was like leading light of the modernist movement. And at the time of the Eranos conference, he had already been excommunicated. That was in 1925. So he was not a member of the church, of the Mater Ecclesia anymore. Now, his main argument is that in the lectures, in his lecture 1935, is that Ignatius, with his spiritual exercises and his understanding, was responsible for the split that one can then see at the time of Bonaiuti between empiricism, scientific empiricism on one hand, and idealism, and Platonic idealism on the other hand. And this kind of split had been cemented, been opened up and cemented by Ignatius and the spiritual exercises. That was his argument. We have a very interesting quotation here. That is quotation 4 from Bonaiutis' autobiography when he was in 1935 in Ascona speaking at the Eranos conference, where he said, "In Ascona, I was dealing with Ignatius' exercises in front of an audience which almost in its totality was extra-Catholic and very likely astray from any practical form of Christianity. Well, my surprise was not little when some of the most well-known, credited and prepared of them about psychological and pedagogical matters addressed me with vivid and persistent critiques, almost as if I made myself responsible of an irreverent attack to a methodological tradition of spiritual education, the Jesuit one, which is taken as a milestone of wisdom, prudence, and capacity." So what has happened is that he spoke about the spiritual exercises in a critical voice, and he was very surprised that at Eranos he found more people supporting the spiritual exercises and then supporting his criticism of it. The third person I want to mention that was important for the lectures on the spiritual exercises is a man called Erich Pschwarer. I would be really interested in how many people have heard of him today in our audience. But if you haven't heard of him, it is not a shame. Unfortunately, it is a shame because we should know him. He was one of the leading Jesuit theologians, particularly in 1920s and 30s. Karl Rahner even said about him, he was the voice and the thinker, the theologian who really brought Ignatius of Loyola on another level. So with him, we can understand Ignatius on a different level, he said. He himself, in the 20s and 30s, was one of the main theologians, very famous for his theory of the analogia entis. Also, one of you will maybe have heard of Karl Barth. So on the Protestant side, Karl Barth, and on the Catholic side, Erich Pschwarer, famous theological debates between those two. But he himself was the editor of the Catholic journal Stimmen der Zeit, which even in the 1930s during the Nazi regime continued to be a voice where Jewish thinkers like Leo Beck or Martin Buber could still publish their articles in Germany. In March 1937, die Stimmen der Zeit, the Voices of Time, they published the encyclica of the Pope mit brennender Sorge. So the encyclica where the Pope condemned Nazism and the pseudo-scientific racism of Hitler and the Nazis. Consequently, his journal was closed down. Pschwarer's Jesuit home was closed as well. He was, because of this constant fear for his well-being, he became mentally very disabled and would not recover to normal state after 1945, unfortunately. But in 1938, he published, from 1938 to 1940, he published 3 volumes on the exercitias spiritualia, which is called Deus Semper Maior. And still today, if you talk to Jesuit theologians, they know Pschwara, they know Deus Semper Maior. It is a very, very important text on the spiritual exercises. Jung himself only knew the first volume because the other 2 volumes they had not been published or not come out at the time of the lectures. But what he found, and that leads to a particular focus of Jung's lectures. So if you read them or you look into them, you will see that Jung concentrates the most of the lectures on a prayer that is called Anima Christi. The Anima Christi, you might know it, is one of the prayers that can be used during the spiritual exercises, but not a necessarily introductory prayer that has to be said before. But Jung thought of it like this, and he also thought of it because Pschwara gives in the first volume of Deus Semper Maior a very long interpretation of the Anima Christi. Then the first volume, I'll show you the cover, also contains the first week as well as the annotations. So the first week is basically has to do with repentance of sin, become aware of your sins. So in a way, this is where Jung can bring in his whole idea of shadow work. That's what he's interested to see here, and Pschwara gives him some kind of ideas about the spiritual exercises here. One also has to say that the book Deus Semper Maior is very, very difficult to read. It is similar to Jung. He doesn't like a lot of footnotes. He hardly any footnote. It is a mixture. It's very of some kind of visionary style, but also linked with phenomenology, with scholastic philosophy. So there are a lot of different strands to Pschwara's way of writing, and it's maybe the last book you would use in front of a lecture of non-lecture audience of non-theologians in Zurich, that is, but that's what it does. And I don't know how our translator Isa did today to translate this text, but I'm sure she can confirm that it is very hard to translate. I'll give you one example that is important for our argument and Jung's argument. Quotation number 5. Thus, man as human being is obviously, as body and spirit, the center of existence of the world. Media formale materiale. As man and woman, the center of the creation of the world. Medium efficiens. As communal being, the center of the order of the world. Medium finale. But this triple center is an intersection of crossing movements, body to spirit, spirit to body, woman to man, man to woman, into over to in. And in it is not only an intersection, but a rift body against spirit, spirit against body, woman against man, man against woman, in against over, over against in. The human as center, crossing rift, thus the increasing realism of life experience appears. Yeah, hard to follow, as you can imagine. But what Jung found here, as we have seen it, is that Schwarer has this idea, similar to Jung, that the human being exists of opposites that are united against each other, as we said, different poles, man to woman, woman to man, body, spirit, spirit against body, in against over, so internally and transcendental, if you want, immanent, transcendental. And what Schwarer is interested in is to show that this union, the opposites can be united, are united through the salvation of Christ on the cross. So that is what Schwarer tries to argue in his book. I give you another quotation here to show you what I mean. Number 6, he says, man as a crossing therefore means man as crucifixion and the crucifixion of God. The hanging in God, as it essentially was to him as a crossing, is thus the hanging on the cross in God as the one hanging on the cross. Thus it is the curse as blessing. He quotes Galatas 3:13-40, Christ being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree, that the blessing might come through Jesus Christ. He continues, the human then in ultimate concreteness means cross curse as cross blessing. Man is, in this only actual order of the supernatural salvation, a real person insofar as he hangs in this cross. But insofar as he hangs in this cross, as the inflation of the absolute center is torn apart in the reality of the nothingness of the rift, and the misery of the rift is born as blessedness of the atonement with God. In the measure of this duality, man is a real human. Good. Thank you for being with me on these quotations. They are, as you can see, there's a lot of phenomenological jargon and a lot of Thomistic and very difficult concept. But I think what Jung was fascinated here about is this idea that the human being is hanging in the cross, and with this cross of the 4 different poles, he is the one who unites the rift. He's not himself, he is the one who actually, and there's another point that Schwarer makes, that he is hanging in God on this cross. But that leads, according to Schwarer, to the temptation to believe that man is God. So when man believes that he's God, this is the primal sin. So, and it is God's salvation by sending his son on the cross that he is helping to bring these unions together by to keep this rift that has been crossed, and therefore to help man to get rid of this primal sin. So therefore man is hanging with the Son of God on the cross, who comes there for the salvation of the human being, of man. So now, just just to give you one idea why Jung might have been so fascinated by that thought. And that leads us back to the Liber Novus, to the Red Book, and to a passage from the 25th of December 1913, where we have a remarkable scene. And if you can read that, that's quotation number 7. I see the cross, the removal of the cross, the mourning, how agonizing this sight is. No longer do I yearn. You must. I see the child with the white serpent in his right hand and the black serpent in his left hand. I see the green mountain, the cross on it, and streams of blood flowing from the summit of the mountain. I can no longer look, it is unbearable. You must. I see the cross and Christ on it in his last hour and last torment. At the foot of the cross, the black serpent has coiled itself. I feel that the serpent of the prophet has wound itself around my feet and ties itself up tightly. The prophet looks at me with fiery gaze. I'm contained that I spread my arms wide as if spellbound. Salome draws near from the right. The serpent has wounded itself around my whole body, and it seems to me as if my countenance is that of a lion. Salome says, Mary was the mother of Christ. Do you understand now? I see that a terrible and incomprehensible power forces me to imitate the Lord in his final torment. But how can I presume to call Mary my mother? You are Christ. I stand with outstretched arms like someone crucified, my body taut and horribly entwined by the serpent. And Elijah looks at me with blazing eyes. You, Salome, say that I'm Christ? It is as if I stood alone on a high mountain with stiff outstretched arms. The serpent squeezes my body in its terrible coils, and the blood streams from my body spilling down the mountainside. Yeah, so you can see that here, if you take it that the Liber Novus was of such importance to Jung, and we know and we think that for, I would say, almost for the rest of his life, he somehow tried to find parallels. He tried to find similar experiences. He tried to find who had this same who had gone through similar understanding, feeling, and then he finds Ignatius. He finds Erich Pschwarer. He sees this idea of the human being on the cross, the union of the poles, united by the human in God. And he not get the theological point that Pschwarer wants to make, but it definitely finds his own experience somehow depicted in that kind of theological text. And even more so, I would say, on a text, on a vision that he read of Ignatius of Loyola. So in this, Ignatius on his way to after his conversion, he had a number of visions that he depicted in his semi-autobiographical text that is called Reminiscences that Jung read. And these visions Jung was with, and in particular one that we see here on this image, and I will read this to you. Just a moment. Yeah, here we see a number of these visions that he had, Ignatius, that is. But if we read the quotation number 9 now, I left out the quotation 8, so the quotation 9, yeah? So this is from Ignatius, where it says, while he was in the almhouse, something happened to him many times. In full daylight, he would see clearly something in the air alongside him, which would give him much consolation, because it was very beautiful, enormously so. He couldn't properly make out what it was an image of, but somehow it seemed to him that it had the shape of a serpent. And he had many things which shone like eyes, though they weren't eyes. He used to take much delight and be consoled by seeing this thing, and the more times he saw it, the more his consolation would increase. And when that thing used to disappear from his sight, he would feel sad about it. So, but what happened is that after a while, after a certain time, when Ignatius very much felt the delight of this appearance, one day he was on the way on the street and saw a cross on the road, and he knelt down in front of the cross to pray, and this entity appeared once more above the cross. But this time, it was the first time that he didn't have this good feeling. What happened is that it manifested itself as in the form of a snake, and it became to Ignatius absolutely clear that this is the devil. And he cast it aside with a stick, and it was said that for the rest of his life, Ignatius always walked around with a stick in case that serpent would reappear, so he can just fought it off. This vision for Jung is most interesting, and he makes a point about this. He says the problem with Ignatius is that he was too much into the dogmatic of the church. Therefore, for him, that he doesn't have allowed the vision of that he doesn't listen to the unconscious in the way that he should. He just thinks that this is the devil from outright, instead of taking other things into consideration. That even the Bible gives us other ideas. In Moses in the desert, who puts the snake lifts up the snake, and for those who are bitten by snakes, to look at the snake and to be healed, something that then John 3:14 Jesus talks about when he said, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. So that could be easily also be a kind of positive image of the serpent and of the snake. But the problem is that he does not allow this, and he even talks about willful rejection of that. And Jung says, if you have a unconscious experience, and you come up with your will to form it, then actually you are like Ignatius, caught into dogmatism, and you're not doing justice to that particular vision. For Jung himself, he interpreted that more in terms of the idea of the healing serpent, like the Kundalini snake. So we know that Ignatius was still hurting from the original accident or the injury that he had, that led to the hospitalization, that led to his conversion. So in a way, the appearance of a snake and that in that context for Jung could also mean that this is indicating the process of a physical healing. So, okay. Yeah. And I think there's lots more to say, but I think what I want to finish with is maybe something just to show you how. Just to show you how important this lecture series and this engagement with Ignatius and the spiritual exercises was to Jung. It is interesting enough the only time in his entire work that Ignatius, that Jung would talk about in such a detailed way about the spiritual exercises. And so in a way, it's something that we can now enjoy for the first time in its entirety. And I'm sure you will all find some interesting thoughts in this lecture series. But what's interesting is that Jung, during the time of these lectures, himself had a vision. And I started my introduction with that vision, and I finished my presentation today with that vision. And I don't want to say anything afterwards about it, because as Jung just told us, we need to let this work without going there with some kind of dogmatic attempt to try to make sense of it. So what Jung says, when I was this is quotation 11, when I was engrossed with psychology and alchemy, no, to be more precise, it was when I was giving the seminar on Ignatius of Loyola. Once in the night, I had a vision of Christ. One night I awoke, and there at the foot of the bed, I saw a crucifix. Not quite life-sized. It was very clear and couched in a bright light. In this light, Christ was hanging on the cross. And then I saw that it was as if his entire body were made of gold, as if of green gold. It looked wonderful. I was scared to death by it. Just then I was particularly engrossed by the Anima Christi, the prayer. There is a very beautiful meditation by Ignatius on it. And I think I would leave it on that. I thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to questions.
Martin, muito obrigado pelo teu trabalho rigoroso, uma pesquisa bastante sólida. Imagino quanto tempo você deve ter levado para poder pesquisar, editar o seminário. Martin, bom, vamos abrir as perguntas para o público, tá? Quem quiser fazer a pergunta, por favor, coloque o nome no chat e eu chamo. Martin, antes de abrir para as perguntas, queria fazer 2 comentários. Bom, um é que esse livro, o volume 1 da História da Psicologia Moderna, das palestras, foi publicado pela Vozes, tá, gente? É importante saber que o volume 1 já está disponível em português. Um segundo comentário que eu queria fazer, Martin, não sei se você sabia, mas os jesuítas tiveram uma forte influência na colonização do Brasil. O Brasil foi descoberto em 1500. Em 1549, a Companhia de Jesus chegou aqui e ajudou muito na catequização dos índios, numa espécie de organização social da colônia. E duas figuras foram bastante destacadas, que é Manuel de Nóbrega e o padre José de Anchieta. Então, temos rastros jesuíticos aqui na colonização brasileira. Acho que um dado histórico importante a partir do que você trouxe. Eu queria comentar fazendo uma pergunta para você. Você acha que seria possível ler a teoria junguiana, o pensamento do Jung, não a obra inteira, mas uma boa parte dela, como um embate de Jung com o cristianismo? Como uma luta do Jung, não exatamente como adversário, mas é o Jung tentando responder de maneira muito particular à mitologia cristã, à filosofia cristã, ao pensamento cristão. Quer dizer, o Jung, a obra do Jung pode ser lida como um diálogo crítico do Jung com o cristianismo. Você acha que é possível? Essa leitura é cabível?
I think that is the most important question almost, and it's difficult to say. I was just in these days, I was having a kind of conversation with a friend, a colleague about this. Certainly, Jung was socialized in a Protestant Christian environment. So, in a way, what he learned, and that's what I wanted to show somehow about Catholicism and also the Jesuits, was somehow quite distorted for a long time. So it was a kind of, as I said, there's a fear, there's a kind of apprehension, there's also fascination. Of course, also, as I said, it was fascinated by it. And in the after the Second World War, he invites a lot of Catholic scholars to discuss his theories. Not to speak about Victor White, of course. We have the letters between Victor White and Jung. But then, as someone said recently, it's like theologically, it is very difficult, for instance, for someone like White, from a Benedictine background, to understand Jung's rejection of the theory of the privatio boni. So, for instance, or there are other ideas of Catholicism that for certain Christians or Catholics would not work, would not go together. No? When we talk about this idea, yes, Jung puts himself on the cross. So if we read that via Pschwara as man hanging in the cross in God, and it's to Christ that is connecting these things, then it's fine. If we read it with Jung's Liber Novus, then we are reminded of Mitraic tradition. As you might, one is the head of a lion. So this is the Mithras cult. So the serpent circling around it. So in a way, what can I say? Christianity plays a role. I think it is a struggle for Jung. He's constant, it's very knowledgeable, but he would not be content to be framed in a dogmatic way that the church would, as a believer, that the church would expect him to be. That is what he actually says about Ignatius. You just follow the dogmas, therefore you can't really understand the vision that the unconscious as the collective son sent you. So yeah, that's I can't really answer that. I can maybe also say that I looked into a certain movement in the 1930s, a Protestant high church movement that is called the Brothers of St. Michael. And they were going from the Protestant Lutheranism closer to Catholicism and developed in the 1930s a certain practice of meditation. They went back to some liturgical practices. They're much closer to the Catholic Church. And they were all in contact with Jung. So all of them, but the leading people were in contact with Jung. But he does never mention it. One would say, why is only Ignatius and the spiritual exercises, these are the kind of parallels you use from 500 years ago, but there is something developing at your doorstep, in your tradition, much closer, which you could actually use an example. And he was taken by that. He really said, oh, it's wonderful what you're doing here. You're going back to the things that the Reformation has actually thrown out, but which were very important for spiritual development and the soul. So yeah, he's struggling with and fascinated by Roman Catholicism, and he's always constantly in contact with theologians and but also with Protestant theologians. But it seems to me that most of them, we have the letters with Adolf Keller, for instance, now. After a while of discussing with Jung, the theological Christian sides get a bit frustrated, because not everything is possible what Jung brings in here. So,
perfeito. A impressão que eu tenho é de que para usar uma expressão sua, essa batalha dele, essa luta dele, está infiltrada em toda a obra, às vezes mais explícita, às vezes nem tanto. Acho que ela está presente na obra inteira. Obrigado, Martin. Sônia, vamos lá?
Boa tarde, professor. Obrigada pela palestra, obrigada pelas coisas, por esse autor também interessante aí, vou tentar depois ler. A minha pergunta tem a ver com a questão histórica, né? A gente sabe que os exercícios espirituais, eles surgiram da Lexio Divina, né? No quarto século, e depois o Inácio de Loyola, ele trocou as fases da meditação e da contemplação, né? E o que me chama a atenção é que eles fazem primeiro a leitura dos textos e depois observam um certo, o que eles chamam, né? Eles chamam de movimento ou de moção, né? O Inácio de Loyola vai falar de moção. Eles não usam a palavra sentimento ainda, né? E quando a gente chega no Jung, ele falando dos exercícios, e ele fala que Inácio de Loyola não deixou, por exemplo, esse outro lado da serpente, né? Ou do inconsciente falar, ou se manifestar, eu me pergunto se é legítimo a gente falar de inconsciente já, sendo que nessa época nem existia ainda subjetividade. Se o senhor puder falar um pouco sobre isso. Obrigada.
Thank you very much. It's very good question. Let's be a bit more precise. Then, yeah, I think the first thing is that, of course, there were spiritual exercises before Ignatius, and there were, and Jung makes a big point at the time, of course, about the devotio moderna. So at the time before Ignatius is not part of the devotio, but his entire theory comes via the Cisneros, Babu, so those monks who brought the ideas of the devotio moderna to Spain. And Jung has some kind of idea that the devotio moderna is much, and the developments before that, they are much more mystical in a way. They give more freedom, more individual freedom to the practitioner, whereas he claims that Ignatius is the one who somehow because of his military background and the idea that he thinks, he brings everything into a kind of category and does not allow for individual development. I'm not so sure, because if I look at at Grote or others from the devotio moderna, these are very complicated systems of meditation. And I think it was a colleague said that someone said that Ignatius actually is a simplifier. So he's taking some of these theories of meditation and meditative practice and makes it easier, makes it more approachable. Together with the devotio moderna, of course, they come out of the monastery. Suddenly, this praxis becomes available to people outside of the monasteries, whereas in former times, in the 12th, 13th century, that was all in the monasteries. So it is a kind of development to bringing a kind of meditative process and spirituality to the people outside of clergy and monastery. So this is, if you want, this is something positive about it. No? Of course, when I talk about, and Jung is somehow, I think, unfairly criticizing Ignatius to a certain extent on that point, when he lifts up the devotio moderna, and Ignatius is making it like popular, easy, and is not giving the kind of chance for a mystical experience as the others would allow you. So that is maybe what Jung is looking at. The contemplatio, as they called it, and he would say the contemplatio that the devotio had and some others is not part of the spiritual exercises. So that's maybe what Jung finds that is lacking here. With the unconscious, of course, there's no unconscious, and again, this is when Jung takes his view and tries to understand what a vision is. So this is an introductory course there, so he talks about this vision of Ignatius as an example. And he takes it from his point of view, with his concept, that of course Ignatius would not agree, and that he didn't see that like this. That's without any doubt. So, but for Jung, in a way, it is the problem that Ignatius use willful force to deal with something that is actually has nothing to do with the will. That is something that comes from an unconscious realm. But for Ignatius, he couldn't know that. But if he would be open enough for allowing other information, then he would probably find something else in these visions than just the devil and that's it. But that's Jung's argument here. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Obrigado, Sônia. Martin, queria pegar uma carona na pergunta da Sônia, e a gente estava discutindo no nosso grupo se os exercícios do Inácio eles já poderiam ser pensados como precursores da prática da imaginação ativa. A gente conseguiria fazer essa semelhança entre a prática da imaginação ativa, como Jung a formulou, e os exercícios espirituais de Inácio de Loyola? Quer dizer, eles se inscrevem numa tradição da imaginação como método, não de investigação do inconsciente, porque essa formulação é muito moderna, mas como uma prática espiritual, de autoconhecimento. Seria possível dizer isso?
I think that's what Jung found so fascinated about it. That's why he's choosing that text in the first place. And you will see if you look at the Eastern examples. So, for instance, in a text called the Sri Chakra Shampara Tantra, Buddhist text. There you get this you have this guided meditation from one step to the next. So first you concentrate on the sun. When you have the sun, then you concentrate on the lake. Then you see the lapis lazuli color of the ice that is floating, and then you go down. You see the lotus, and then you come to the Buddha, and you come to and so on and so on. And for Jung, the spiritual exercises are the Western equivalent to this kind of meditative practices. And what these practices ask you to do, and what the spiritual exercises ask you to do as well, is imagine, let's say, Christ on the cross with all your senses. Imagine the tactile, the smell, the noise, the crying, your feet standing in the sand, whatever you can imagine. Use all your imagination to feel yourself and to go into this situation, where these exercises, or these exercises in the East and in the West, differ, to my understanding, is that they are guided, that they give you certain images that you work with. So everyone gets the same image, and then you start from that. And then once you have worked your way through that image, you get the next image. So like on a scale from one to the other one. And the active imagination, the psychological process, would give you the freedom to what comes up, you follow. So, or you don't follow, that's up to you. But it's not guided by a spiritual leader, by the therapist telling you what you have to start with. So I think that's where, in my understanding, the difference lies.
Perfeito. Perfeito. Obrigado.
Yeah.
Luciana?
Martin, super obrigada pela preciosidade do material que você trouxe para a gente. Eu fiquei pensando o seguinte: o catolicismo é muito próximo da nossa realidade, né? A gente tem histórias, a gente tem lembranças, a gente tem recalques e, né, vivências difíceis, né, no catolicismo, muitos de nós. E você trouxe umas palavras aí que eu fui até anotando da relação do Jung com, né, com os jesuítas, né, com a imagem da igreja, com as igrejas mesmo. Então, você falou de medo, você falou de inquietação, de opressão, né, uma certa fascinação. Nos meus estudos de psicologia, fica muito mais fácil eu conseguir simbolizar deuses quando eu falo de mitologia grega, porque eu acho que está mais distante. Eu queria entender se você acha que o Jung tinha lugares diferentes para se relacionar com a mitologia cristã e com a mitologia grega, por conta dessas palavras, por conta dessas emoções que a mitologia cristã causava nele.
Fascinating question. Thank you. I don't want to speculate on Jung's psychological state or why he would. I can't. But I think you're absolutely right that this Catholicism, that the way he presents it, the way he talks about it, that it comes as a first childhood memory, and then it comes as a negative memory with so much blood, fear. Then when he talks about the Catholic Church, that he was afraid to enter the church without the feeling of blood and oppression, and that he was even not comfortable in the presence of a Catholic priest. So all of that, of course, shows that there is something that would be interesting to look. Why is that? Where does this come from? And go deeper, but it gets into a kind of speculative realm. But the interesting thing is, it seems that on the other hand, there is a fascination with that. There's it's like this fear and fascination. It's almost like Rudolf Otto, the idea of the sacred and the two sides of the sacred. That on one hand you stand in awe and fear, on the other hand it makes you shiver, but in fact as something that fascinates you. So yeah, these two sides are there, and it seems to me that at a certain age he starts to get rid of to work through this fear, and he starts to get in contact with Catholic priests, with theologians. He starts to talk about these theories. He invites them to present in a safe distance, maybe, yes, from. Is always the psychologist. Is always the psychologist. There's also I think I tried to make the point in my introduction that when he criticizes Ignatius, then he says Ignatius sees this vision, and what he says in a context of a certain atmosphere, of a certain zeitgeist, of a certain way that time he's living, and therefore he has a particular view on these things. They are influenced by the context in which he's living, you might say. And that shapes his understanding of experiences like this. I thought, but can't we say that Jung and his visions, and we heard some visions of Jung, that the way he deals with that is in a kind, at certain moments, as a kind of scientific, psychological atmosphere. So he lives in another context than Ignatius, and I think Sonia said this before. He lives in a time of psychoanalysis, of psychotherapy, of the unconscious, and he lives in a time when you take an experience like that and you try to give it a kind of scientific contextualization. That's why he comes up with his theoretical texts. He tries to give some scientific explanation to what happened to him in 1913, 14, and so on. So one can say when he criticizes, let's say, for Ignatius for having a prejudice and Vorurteil, you know? So he has a prejudice as well when he looks at his own visions. So that's maybe something one can say about this. Yeah.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Lu. Martin, me confirma uma informação. O Jung também nunca conseguiu ir a Roma, não foi?
I don't. Yeah, I still. No, I don't. The Vatican, I don't think so. No. Why? Just. Do you have a question about this, or is it just?
Não,
The fear from.
Não, eu ia através da pergunta da Luciana. Isso. É engraçado que tanto Jung quanto Freud nunca conseguiram ir a Roma, né? É muito curioso isso. Mas vamos lá. Martinha?
No, I think Freud went to Rome then.
Freud desmaiava na
Jung
desmaiava na como que chama no trem? Como é que se chama? Na estação de trem. Né? Acho que Freud também não conseguia ir. Mas só um comentário. Martinha, contigo, querida.
That's true, yeah.
Bom, primeiro, obrigada aí pela palestra, muito boa. Eu queria só fazer uma pergunta assim, não é bem fora de contexto, né? Mas o que me passou, né? O que veio a questão, né? Quando Jung chama, né? Quer dizer, ele trabalha com essas questões, né? De Inácio de Loyola, trabalha com essa questão religiosa, muitas vezes, né? Muitas pessoas, né, muitos junguianos, ou que se dizem junguianos, começam a trabalhar essas coisas como se fosse mesmo uma questão religiosa, né, quase que literaliza isso, e até mesmo, por exemplo, o livro vermelho, né, as visões de Jung, então, são as visões, sei lá, ele teve contato com Deus. Então, essa linguagem religiosa que Jung usa, né, como, acho que, como imagens, né, mas, assim, por mais que se possa falar do lado religioso, mas ele está trabalhando de um outro modo. Queria que você falasse um pouquinho disso, né, que eu acho que...
Yeah, no, definitely. I haven't gone really into the contents of his lectures. And because I always tend to think I'm better in giving a kind of contextualization than to go into psychological material that he's working on. But certainly, I think what he's trying to do is, and that's for sure, is to find a mythological and that's a Christian parallel to the individuation process. So what you will find in the book on the yoga and the Buddhist meditation is that is always looking at these different stages of development within the process of meditation, or with Jung, we active imagination. So and is giving the parallels here between the Eastern and often the alchemical process. So the alchemy lends itself very well on different levels of, he sees it also as a kind of meditation, as a kind of active imagination, starting with the Nigredo and going via the CCG and leading to the homunculus, and then this kind of development in the alchemic process. But all of that is certainly, if you, as you say rightly, is certainly an attempt to find a kind of mythological and parallel to his own psychological model. So he tries to explain these theories, if you want, psychologically. He's very careful not to say this. I think he had a lot of respect for these traditions. But the way he uses it, or the reason he uses it, is because he wants to show that this is something his individuation process within the psychotherapeutical process can do precisely the same. And that's what he also says about famously, if you are a believer, if you believe in the dogma of the church, you don't need to come to me, because you have everything you need there. You have 2,000 years of experience and of spiritual advisors who can help you there. And this is a bit of a tragic point when it comes to Yolanda Jacobi, because she wants to come to Jung in 1938 when the Nazis come to Austria, and she wants to flee and she wants to study with him and so on. And he is very apprehensive towards her. And he says things like in a letter, why do you want to come to me? If you are a Catholic, you go to your priest. He can do more for you than I can do. That's a kind of respectful way on one hand. On the other hand, it's also a bit drastic to reject someone on that ground. But he then accepted her, of course. But that's, yeah.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Martinha, querida. Martin, queria mudar um pouco o tema da nossa conversa e te perguntar como foi o teu encontro com a obra do Jung, né? Como é que a obra do Jung chegou até você? Se isso foi uma escolha intencional, se você foi atravessado por ela. Queria saber como é que é teu encontro com a obra do Jung, e queria que você falasse também um pouquinho da importância da Philemon Foundation para a comunidade junguiana. Como é que você vê o trabalho que você, Chandassani, Falzer tem feito. Queria que você localizasse a gente um pouco nesse projeto.
Well, yeah, thank you. Jung's work. There are different aspects, but I'm just on a very straightforward biographical way. I did my PhD, my doctor thesis on in philosophy on Nietzsche, as you mentioned, and my interest was the seminar that C.G.Jung held at the Psychological Club in Zurich on Friedrich Nietzsche's Das Buch Zarathustra from 1934 to 1939. And at that time, I was not looking to go into Jung studies. I was trying to find a dialogue between Nietzschean understanding and of the world and wills to power, and psychological understanding of the world as the one of Jung. And those two, they seem to collide. It was an interesting collision between those two views of the world. But then I got somehow more interested into Jung via this reading. One of the things that I would like to say is that often when you read Jung on particular cultural texts or cultural, like Das Buch Zarathustra, or Ignatius' spiritual exercises. If you expect that Jung does justice to this text within the framework of the interpretations and the research and the knowledge, and then you will be disappointed, and that is in many areas. But if you come from a Jungian point of view and you take this as a Jungian reading of the text, and this is what you can do with that text. I even think that he uses philosophical concepts of Nietzsche, for instance, and he says he uses them as tools to express something that where no other name has been found so far. So that is interesting. So for a philosopher, you have a concept that is defined, that is, I don't know, whatever we use, the cogito ergo sum, let's say Descartes, cogito, that means that. But Jung then could use the word cogito and make something completely different out of it, and gives it a psychological meaning to say something about our unconscious. And that makes every philosopher furious, and that makes every theologian furious, that you take this very finely defined and accurate things and make something else of it. So you maybe, would it be wrong to say to symbolize it in a way? So you give it a kind of openness that is the opposite of what a philosopher would like to do, for instance. So that was something that interested me a lot about Jung. And then because I was working so much in the 1930s on Jung, as Jung in the 1930s, I then had the chance to continue that work with the Neumann Jung letters, and so bit by bit, I got into a kind of historical research on Jung, and that brought me also close to the Philemon Foundation and to the work of the Philemon Foundation, and I think what all these Philemon scholars, not me, but they make a wonderful work. I think that this is, and also the people that contribute to that, and I think it's a great achievement what Sono has done and what all those people supporting the Philemon Foundation have done. It has just opened our world to so much more that Jung is than just the collected works that we had. So I think that's a good thing. What I really would wish for is that there would be more translations into Portuguese, for instance, or into Spanish. There are, but or even into German. The original German is lagging behind. So we're publishing with the Philemon the English texts, and the German publishers struggle to keep up. So some of the texts that we have published are not available in the original German yet. So let's hope that will be okay. And I very much hope also that the Ignatius lectures will be published in Brazil. We come out in Brazil soon, hope. That would be wonderful, as someone has mentioned rightly, and you as well. The connection is of course very strong, and the interest with the Jesuit tradition, you know. So but as I said, the Philemon Foundation is always working on the English texts, and then the family Jung grants the rights to the other publishers in other languages to translate. That has unfortunately nothing to do with the Philemon Foundation, except that the work of the Philemon is translated. But we have the Neumann-Jung letters, for instance, have been translated into French, Italian, German, English. And I hear him a Chinese translation will be out. So that's because I can't verify how good the translation would be. But so hopefully there will be also a lot of translated texts into Brazilian and Portuguese.
O seminário de Zaratustra, ele acabou de ser traduzido para o português. Foi lançado esse mês, né? Acho que é um grande acervo para o público brasileiro. E no dia 23 de setembro, o Paul Bishop vai estar aqui no Teatros falando sobre seminários, que tem um livro fabuloso, né? O Selfie Dionisíaco. É uma figura, uma referência, então vai ser um grande prazer. Martin, queria te agradecer. Queria primeiro te agradecer pela tua generosidade. Você gentilmente respondeu de imediato o nosso convite. Fiquei muito feliz. Obrigado pela tua disponibilidade, pelo teu carinho e parabéns pelo trabalho que você tem feito e continuará a fazer. Queria te deixar um convite em aberto para que você volte aqui ano que vem, seja para falar sobre o seminário das cartas do Jung Neumann, sobre o seminário de alquimia que vai ser lançado. Será um prazer te receber. Espero que você goste do nosso convite. Marcos, mas eu queria te fazer a última pergunta. No início da palestra, você trouxe uma imagem de um livro que dos esquerdos, que uma imagem do fogo eterno, né, que impressionou bastante o Jung. A minha pergunta para você é, diante desse cenário mundial que a gente vive, né, movimentos políticos de direita, um avanço da tecnologia desenfreado, desordem climática, nós vamos escapar de arder no fogo eterno? Temos alguma chance de escapar?
I hope that was a rhetorical question, but I can actually, I always like to think, because we were talking about Jesuits and Karl Rahner, the famous Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who said, there is a hell. For sure, there's an inferno, but we might be surprised that it is actually empty.
Ah, que ótima frase! Excelente, excelente.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you so much for your patience. And I look forward to seeing you again.
Muito obrigado, Marte. Um grande prazer te receber. Obrigado pela sua disponibilidade conosco. Sinta-se à vontade. Espero que a gente possa te receber novamente ano que vem. Pessoal, obrigado pela
Thank you very
presença.
much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Obrigado pela presença. Isa, obrigado pela tradução. Lu, pelo apoio de sempre. Voltamos agora no dia 15, né, Lu?
Sim, com a Mineres falando do livro Escute as Feras. Aliás, quem vier, espero que venham, ela pediu para ler o livro.
Pessoal, bom fim de semana. Não ardam no fogo do inferno. Se protejam. Pode ser que o inferno esteja vazio. É a melhor frase de hoje. Um grande abraço em todos. Até lá.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.